This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. I would be very surprised if this video is the first time that you're hearing the name Beowulf. Whether you first heard of it in your high school English class, or because of the many adaptations it's had over the years, or maybe even in the context of the work of fantasy authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, Beowulf is fundamental to our understanding of early English literature. It's one of the very few remaining pieces of literature we have from the so-called Dark Ages. It's a snapshot of a long-lost culture, and it captures a fascinating point in history when Europe was teetering between its pagan past and its Christian future. Whether it's the surprisingly deep story itself, the long-lasting impact that it's had on academia, or the echoes that can still be felt in contemporary literature, Beowulf might just be one of the most significant stories ever told. I want to begin by establishing that Beowulf is old. Not quite Epic of Gilgamesh levels of old, but so old that despite the fact that this poem is written in what we consider to be the English language, I doubt that any of you would be able to understand it in its original form. The concept of Old English is something that I've found a lot of people misunderstand. I've even heard people call Shakespeare Old English, but the thing is that even with its to-bes or not to-bes, Shakespeare is actually early modern English. Early modern English is grammatically different, it has a different vocabulary, and the spelling can be a bit wacky, but the reality is that most of us can understand Shakespeare if we're able to sit with it and digest it for a minute. But roughly 400 years before we see modern English emerging, we have a period that we call Middle English. This is a form of the English language that isn't super recognizable, but let's just say if you time traveled back to the year 1400, you'd probably be able to communicate basic things like food, water, and fire, but I doubt that you'd be able to have a long conversation with anyone. The following is a passage from a 14th century text, and you'll notice that especially when it's read aloud, a lot of words and phrases sound kind of comprehensible. You can get the gist even without a direct translation. Ye shall tell hit as tit as e'en tun hard with tongue, as it is stad and stoken, in story stiff and strong, with lel letters loken, in Lunde so hat's been long. So that was Middle English, but Beowulf was written in Old English. And the deal with Old English is that essentially, if you time traveled to any time before roughly 1150, you are going to be completely lost. You're not going to understand a word of what the random peasants around you are saying, and they're not going to understand a word of what you're saying, and they might burn you for being a witch. As an example, here's the opening of Beowulf in the original language, or at least my best attempt at pronouncing the original language. What? We gardena in yadagum, theod kninga thrim yefrunon, huda athalingas elen fremedon. In order to be read by most people, Beowulf must be translated, which unfortunately means that most of the times when we read it today, we lose the inherent verse. It is, after all, a poem, although it is written with very different poetic stylings to what we usually see today. Beowulf was written in alliterative verse, in which each line breaks into roughly 2 sections, with a slight pause in between, and the beginnings of each of those sections tend to start with a similar sound. Take, for example, Theodkaninga Thrym Yefrunon. In that line, which has a rough break in the middle, the th sounds are the same on both sides. It's a much looser poetic style than we're used to hearing. There's not a lot of rhyme, and there's not a whole lot of rhythm, but it does have its own beauty. As Tolkien once said, it's more like masonry than music. Unfortunately, I am not learned enough to recite the whole poem to you in Old English, but if you are interested in hearing more of the poem in Old English, I will link a YouTube video or 2 of people performing it in the original language. However, if I was to ever learn to recite the entirety of Beowulf in Old English, I would want a platform in order to, record and share this experience. And you know what a great platform for that would be? This video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. Using Squarespace's cutting-edge design intelligence technology, it is incredibly easy to unlock your creative potential and build a beautiful, personalized website tailored exactly to your unique needs. And for all of you online business owners, you can actually handle all of your payments directly through your Squarespace site. It's so simple, you can get started in just a few clicks, and you can start receiving payments right away. You can also offer extra payment methods like Klarna, Apple Pay, Afterpay, or ClearPay. You can also create and sell online courses all through Squarespace. Start with a layout that fits your brand, upload videos, and customize everything with next-generation editing technology. And you can put these courses behind a paywall, either with a one-time fee or a subscription. If you're interested in refreshing an existing brand or starting an entirely new one, you should check out Squarespace. Just head on down to squarespace.com for a totally free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. The tale of Beowulf begins with Hrothgar, the king of Denmark, and his noble heritage and his building of the great mead hall Heorot. Mead halls are an early medieval gathering place of sorts, where a community would come together to feast, drink, and share songs and stories. But the sounds of revelry from Heorot wake something in the nearby marshes. Grendel was that grim creature called, the ill-famed haunter of the marches of the land. That accursed thing, ravenous and grim, swift was ready. 30 nights he seized upon their couch, thence back he got him gloating over his prey, faring homeward with his glut of murder to seek his lairs. Grendel comes in the night, picking off Hrothgar's men one by one. They pray to God, they make sacrifices, but nothing will appease the wrath of the mighty Grendel. Word of Hrothgar's plight spreads far and wide across the land until it reaches the ears of Beowulf, a Geatish prince. He leaves his home, which is in modern-day southern Sweden, and heads for Hrothgar's hall, ready to face Grendel head-to-head unarmed. Beowulf is welcomed into Heorot, and that night, when Grendel creeps inside searching for his prey, a predator is waiting for him. Onward and nearer he stepped, seized then with hand the valiant-hearted man upon his bed. Against him the demon stretched his claw, and swiftly he laid hold on it, and with hate in heart he propped him on his arm. Straightway that master of evil perceived that never had he met within this world in earth's four corners on any other man a mightier gripe of hand. In heart and soul he grew afraid, yet none the sooner could escape. His desire would haste away, he would to hiding flee, seeking the devil's throng. Not now were his dealings there such as he ever before in the days of his life had found. Beowulf simply grabs Grendel by its arm, and the grip of his hand is so strong that in his haste to flee, Grendel rips his own arm clean off. The beast flees, dying of his wounds elsewhere, and Beowulf's victory is celebrated. They string up Grendel's arm in the hall, and the feasting, carousing, and sharing of stories goes long into the night. But as it turns out, this feasting may have been a bit premature. In the shadow of the evening, another beast arrives, the more fearsome and more foul mother of Grendel. She comes seeking vengeance for her fallen son, and she slaughters one of Hrothgar's men before slinking back to her underwater lair. The next morning, Beowulf sees what's happened, and he sets out to finish the job, to purge this land of evil, and he dives into the lake, ready to face Grendel's mother in her own territory. The surging sea engulfed that warrior bold. Thereafter a long hour of the day it was ere he could descry the level floor. Straightway that creature that with cruel lust, ravenous and grim, had 100 seasons held the watery realm, perceived that there from on high some man was come to espy the dwelling of inhuman things. She clutched then at him, seized in her dire claws the warrior bold. They grapple fiercely in the mother's lair, hand-to-hand combat, and they're evenly matched. Beowulf is only able to slay Grendel's mother by using a giant sword that she has in her treasure hoard. With the mother slain, Beowulf finds the corpse of Grendel, so he beheads it, brings the decapitated head back with him, and then they are able to truly celebrate. Denmark has been rid of its monsters forever. Hrothgar pours gifts and praise onto Beowulf, claiming that he is like a son to him, and Beowulf returns home a true hero, laden with praise and treasure. And when Beowulf's father, the Geatish king, dies, he takes that role, becoming a wise and great king. Well, he ruled it for 50 winters. Now was he a king of many years, aged guardian of his rightful land, until a certain one in the dark nights began to hold sway. A dragon, even he who on the high heath watched his hoard, his steep stone barrow. Below lay a path little known to men. Therein went some nameless man, creeping in nigh to the pagan treasure. His hand seized a goblet deep, bright with gems. This the dragon did not after in silence bear. A foolish thief wakes the dragon, and it tears across Beowulf's land, spewing fire and death as it goes. Although he is now old, he's been ruling for 50 years, Beowulf is not willing to back down from a challenge, and he arms up to face the dragon himself. He's followed by the younger warriors of his kingdom, so that they can watch what will hopefully be his victory. But this is not one of his easy, clandestine victories of his youth. Beowulf struggles fearsomely with the dragon, and the young warriors lose hope and flee. All of them except one, the ever-faithful Wiglaf. Young Wiglaf stays, and he joins in the fight when it seems that Beowulf is going to be overwhelmed, but it's too late. The dragon is killed, but it poisons Beowulf with its deadly venom in its death throes. Since he had no heirs, Beowulf decides to leave his throne to Wiglaf with his dying breath, his only loyal soldier. And then his final wish is that Wiglaf goes into the dragon's hoard and brings out the treasure, so that he might look upon the wealth that he's leaving behind for his people. His final words are as follows. To the Master of all, the glorious King and everlasting Lord, I speak now my words of thanks for these fair things that I here gaze upon. For that I have been suffered ere my death's hour such wealth to gather for my people. Now that I have for the hoard of precious things bartered the span of mine old life, do ye henceforth furnish the people's needs. No longer may I here remain. To Wiglaf he says, Thou art the end and latest of our house of Wagman's line. All hath fate swept away of my kinsfolk to their appointed doom, good men of valor. I must follow them. That was the latest word that issued from that aged heart and breast, ere he betook him to the pyre, and to the hot surge of warring flames. From his bosom did the soul depart to seek the judgment of the just. Wiglaf returns with the treasure and to take the throne, but there is a deep-set unease throughout the kingdom. Beowulf was, both figuratively and literally, their protector. All of the wealth in the world can't make up for the fact that he is now gone. Alone and vulnerable, Beowulf's people mourn the cruel machinations of fate that brought the great hero to his knees. As Wiglaf says, too mighty was the doom that thither drew this mortal man. Fate is one of the main tragedies at Beowulf. It's a force that can be seen at work from the very beginning to the very end of the tale. Fate brought him to Heorot. It's what allowed him to kill Grendel. It is what put the sword in his hand so that he might slay Grendel's mother. Fate gave him the most profound triumphs and joys of his life. But as fate gives, so it takes away. Beowulf's luck couldn't last forever, and in the end, it is fate that destroys the hero that it once made. Certainly, Beowulf had renown and love during his life, but it was also his unending dedication to heroism that placed him within the very jaws of death. It makes for a great story, but it is inevitably a tragic one. But fate versus the individual man is not the only conflict that we see in Beowulf. There's also a very distinct tension between the masculine and the feminine. The very centerpiece of the story is Beowulf's fight with Grendel's mother, the only main female character that we see in this story. Grendel's mother represents an utter mockery of everything that womanhood was meant to be in these sorts of stories. Women were the cupbearers, the truce makers, the peace weavers. They were mothers binding the community together through their marriage and offspring, acting as caretakers for the doers of glorious deeds. But Grendel's mother is not a peace weaver. She is a destroyer of community. Her offspring doesn't become a great hero, it becomes a monster. And Grendel doesn't accomplish glorious deeds, he only slaughters and then is slaughtered. Beowulf enters the story already a hero in his own right, but untested in his masculine pride. He begins to prove himself worthy when he fights Grendel, but it isn't until he faces the flip side of that coin that he becomes a true hero. He grapples with the mother on her own turf, and it's described in a curiously almost sexual way. There is groping and embraces, and when Beowulf is finally victorious, he emerges from the water in this lurid swirling of foamy, bloody water. Beowulf must grapple with this manifestation of feminine evil and emerge anew, baptized by the waters that he crawls from, ready to embrace both the positive masculine and positive feminine side of him. From there, Beowulf does go on to fulfill a role that for its time would have been thought of as female-coded. He is the peace weaver, the young person coming from afar to establish familial bonds with a distant community, much like a bride being married off to strengthen an alliance. When he returns home the master of both the masculine and feminine, a truly wise and level-headed king. But there is one more conflict that I want to discuss that is probably the most significant. You may have noticed in some of the sections of Beowulf that I read to you, the curious inclusion of direct Christian references. They call Grendel the descendant of Cain, one of Adam and Eve's children, and Beowulf calls out to Almighty God in his last words. And this might not be something that you expect from a story that was originally told in pagan times. A story that includes human sacrifice and monsters and weird fate. That is weird spelled W-Y-R-D, like the Weird Sisters from Macbeth, not just normal weird. And truth be told, there probably was an earlier version of the story of Beowulf that didn't include any of these Christian references. It is hypothesized that the version of Beowulf, the extant manuscript that we have, is not an original story, but that the story of Beowulf is much older, and that it may have very likely originated from a time when Europe was not predominantly Christian. So it's probably based off of that older and significantly more pagan myth, but it also might not be. We'll never know. That's something that's just lost to history. So it would be easy enough to claim, and a lot of people have claimed, that the author of the Beowulf manuscript was himself a Christian, which we are almost positive that he was, and that he imposed Christianity onto this purely pagan story just because he thought it would be cool, and that was his own belief system. However, this isn't a totally clear representation of what probably happened. By the time that Beowulf was being written, around the year 1000, probably, that's another highly debated thing, Christianity was already a thing. It had, in fact, been the predominant thing in Europe for like 300 years. So while it is absolutely technically possible that the scribe of the Beowulf manuscript was the very first person to superimpose Christianity onto the story, in all likelihood the inclusion of Christian elements goes back way further and is probably a much more integrated part of the Beowulf storytelling tradition. So all of that background is basically to say that this conflict that we start to see emerge in the story between the old pagan ways and the new Christian ways is not incidental. It's not just something that should be written off. In fact, it actually ends up being one of the central conflicts of the story. Beowulf is a hero very much in line with older traditions. The way that he handles problems head on, no thinking, no planning, no introspection or prayer. It's very representative of the vision of the older style of warrior. And for a while, this serves him very well. He becomes a hero, he is admired, he's loved, he's rich, he's the king. However, by the time he's a little bit older, these values no longer serve him quite as well. Since he never routed out the true source of evil in his youth, in his old age, it comes back to haunt him. Monstrosity rears its hideous head, and he no longer has the reassurance of youth or of weird fate on his side. With little help from God or from his community, the pagan warrior dies alone and heirless, with little but gold and stories as his legacy. We end the story unsure of the final fate of Beowulf's soul. As William Reynolds writes, "In presenting the Christian answer to the problem of evil in the world, the Beowulf poet has chosen as his hero a figure who, although he embodies everything good in the stoical Germanic defiance of fate, consistently falls short of Christian belief. Beowulf accepts situations as he finds them. He does the best he can, disregarding results and emphasizing effort, but he can go only so far in understanding and dealing with the affairs of the world, for his is the pagan view. Hopeless, limited, and yet brave, and within limits admirable." This story is not purely a condemnation of Beowulf. It exalts him as a hero, but it does make clear the author's opinions on the role that the old ways now hold. Those who follow the old ways are admirable and strong and perhaps even deserving of a story, but they are not powerful and ageless as they would be if they were following the ways of the Christian God. All of these themes and more can be found within the text of Beowulf, but it was not always thought of as being so thematically complex. In fact, for a long time, the predominant belief of scholars was that the actual story of Beowulf got in the way of the work's true value, its historical data. And of course, while I do completely disagree that Beowulf's story doesn't have value, I do understand why this belief became so prominent. After all, Beowulf is fiction. When it comes to the actual conflicts at play, Beowulf fighting a dragon, that is technically not real. You're never gonna find archaeological evidence of Grendel or Grendel's mother. Beowulf and the story told in Beowulf is not directly historically true. But just in being a work that was at its time written to be intentional fiction, Beowulf is an astonishingly rare find. Back in the day, in order for something to go through the intensely laborious, time-consuming, and expensive process of being written down, much less being preserved through history, the thing that you were writing down had to be really, really important. They tended to prioritize things like history, the genealogies of kings, the medical knowledge that they had at the time. Think about it. If you were asked to preserve one piece of media that would survive for the next millennia into whatever the future is gonna hold, you're probably more likely to look at things like the Encyclopedia Britannica rather than a box set of The Simpsons. So having a preserved story, a work of true fiction from the Dark Ages, is incredibly rare. Beowulf is, like, pretty much all we've got. And that fact becomes a lot more amusing and kind of horrifying when you consider the fact that we did come, like, this close to losing the Beowulf manuscript entirely. The singular existing manuscript of Beowulf can be found in a larger collection that we now call the Noel Codex. This was incorporated into a collection of other works, which included one of the few original copies of the Magna Carta, and the only existing copy of the medieval Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This collection was unexplainably significant, especially when it comes to English literary history, which is why it was given to the British Library for safekeeping. It was shortly after, in the 18th century, taken out of the British Library because they realized that where they had it was a bit of a fire hazard, so they put it in a separate house for safekeeping. Of course, because the universe has a sense of humor, that separate house, which was deemed a safe place, with all of its very precious and irreplaceable documents, just a couple months later went up in flames itself. The Noel Codex containing the Beowulf manuscript had to be thrown out a window in order to be extinguished, but luckily it was saved. Burn marks on the pages and all. Still, although people knew that the Beowulf manuscript existed in the 18th century, it didn't receive the praise or the recognition that it deserved until much later. By the end of the 1700s, people were starting to make copies of the Beowulf manuscript, thank God, and by the early 1800s we started to see translations into modern language, but most of these studies were being done because of the pure historical value of Beowulf as an artifact. They liked the historical references that it contained, they liked it as a reference point for the language of the time, but they saw little to no value in the actual story and the actual poetry that it contained. As W.P. Kerr observed, "The fault of Beowulf is that there is nothing much in the story. The hero is occupied in killing monsters like Hercules or Theseus, but there are other things in the lives of Hercules and Theseus besides the killing. Beowulf has nothing else to do. It is too simple." They were willing to praise its prose, its historical value, and its noble tone, but the overall scholarly mindset was that the story was just too thin, simple, and archetypical to be of any significance. This was the belief until one particular scholar came along, a certain J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien had long since harbored a fascination with the early medieval period, and encouraged by discoveries like that at Sutton Hoo, he was determined to pull back the veil on the so-called Dark Ages. He believed that this time was not a cultural black hole, not a stagnation in human progress, but rather that works like Beowulf proved that there was a thriving storytelling tradition in Europe, even back in the days before it was well documented. He wanted Beowulf to be digested in the way that it had been originally intended to be consumed, as art. In his 1936 lecture called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien takes on the scholarly perception of Beowulf, which he refers to as Beowulfania. He provides this allegory to explain its issues. A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in the building of the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting," but they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did not he restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion." But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. Tolkien had a firm and undying belief that any story, if overanalyzed, it was at risk of losing its magic entirely. Yeah, of course, if you tear Beowulf into its component parts, if you turn it into a bullet point list, it's going to seem simple and thin, but the story was never meant to be presented in that way. It was poetry, it was song, it was written with a particular authorial voice, and these are things that bestow importance and beauty into a story in a way that a SparkNotes summary could never capture. Besides, these storytelling conventions that scholars wrote off as thin or unnoteworthy are the kinds of conventions that we can still find in contemporary storytelling. The idea of the outsider hero coming in to eliminate monsters from the town, the catharsis of watching a brave, good man fall victim to tragic fate. We still use heroic narratives to shape, define, and rewrite our cultural values today. Just because these are tropes that have been seen again and again, that doesn't make them inherently worthless. Besides, if you are willing to consider the story seriously and at its face value, there is a breathtaking intensity to the heroism that it presents. This is a kind of heroism built on a distinct hopelessness. For these pagan heroes, there's no hope of an eternal reward. When the world ends in Ragnarok, that is the gods being killed. The good guys lose, and yet these heroes are still fighting. This type of heroism ended up being very impactful for a lot of 20th century fantasy and fiction authors, especially, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. The 20th century represented a complete shift and, in a way, a reversal of the way that we viewed the world, especially the way that we viewed warfare. In World War I and II, evil showed its face in unheard of ways. Before this, with the introduction of science, communication, and technology, there seemed to be this growing sense that we had everything under control. We understood how the world worked. We were the top dogs. We were the most dominant predators, and the world bowed down to us. But the world wars reasserted that there are certain things, certain evils, that humanity may never really overcome. There is weird fate at work even today, and reaching back to the bleak, uncontrollable, monstrous world of Beowulf is both a warning and a kind of comfort. The fact that there can still be heroism even in such a bleak world is kind of a beautiful thing. Glimpses of this bravery in the face of hopelessness can be found in some of the most widely recognized and appreciated literature and media of our recent centuries. There is such value in Beowulf for the way that it proves storytelling to be truly timeless. We shouldn't ignore the fact that Beowulf is old, and even being, 1,000 years old, it is still a retelling of a story that they considered to be old. It was wrought out of the strange, simmering soup of collective imagination that they had at the time it was written, and in that, it still has applicability today. Beowulf is not some relic. It's not this untouchable, perfect drop of history preserved in amber. It is still living and breathing and thriving in untold ways through the art and craft of storytelling. a craft and practice that reaches forward and backward to unite all of us across stretches of time and space. In The Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien makes particular note of the nostalgia that infuses and powers works like Beowulf. Beowulf is not a primitive poem, it is a late one, using the materials then still plentiful, preserved from a day already changing and passing, a time that has now forever vanished, swallowed into oblivion, using them for a new purpose, with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force. When new, Beowulf was already antiquarian in a good sense, and it now produces a singular effect. For it is now to us itself ancient, and yet its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have that are both poignant and remote. We love old stories. I mean, at least I do, and if you're on my channel, I kind of assume that you do too. But there is something just so irresistible about the idea of the past. We have this longing for bygone days, even if we weren't alive to see those days go by. And I think that storytelling is uniquely suited to filling that gap within the human condition. Beowulf is an incredible example of the way that really good storytelling can transcend time and space. It can reach back into the past, it can reach forward into the future, and it can make us all the more aware of, cautious of, and grateful for the present. I know that when I first read Beowulf in my high school English class, I was probably 15, I didn't really get it. To be fair, I probably read either a really bad translation or just looked up the Spark Notes on it because I wasn't a very good student, but I really didn't come to appreciate the story until my adult life. So I would love to hear in the comments what your experiences have been with Beowulf. You know, if you've ever been able to engage deeper with the story and what you've been able to get out of it if you have. As always, my sources are linked in the description, as well as at least one link to a performance of Beowulf. It's debated whether or not Beowulf would have originally been sung or performed with music, perhaps even like as an improv-style play, and I really love live performances of Beowulf. It's a really fun rabbit hole to go down, and someday, if the cards work out in my favor, I would love to produce a Beowulf short film with my own artistic stylings, but we'll see if that ever happens. Stay tuned. And if you want to stay tuned, you can go ahead and check out my Patreon if you want to support me on there. If not, feel free to subscribe to the channel and like the video because that really helps me out. Okay, if you couldn't tell, it is freezing out here, and I'm a little bundled up and my fingertips are about to freeze off, so I'm gonna go ahead and go. But thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.